everyone. So you should have completed this satire web quest last week, and there was a lot of different elements that are reviewed in here, so I wanted to make sure that I also go over it with you so you feel confident and know you're on the right track when it comes to satire, especially because you are going to be taking a quiz on the information that is in this web quest on November 18th. That is a Wednesday. You will be taking a quiz on the satire elements that are in this web quest. So this will be a really good study tool and review tool for when you are taking your quiz. So please make sure, especially if you're an online student, please make sure that you watch this video in full to make sure that you are comfortable and prepared for your quiz. So starting with the definition of satire, the definition of satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. So that is the definition coming from dictionary.com. I would study this definition, hint, hint, and this is the definition that we're going to use anytime we study satire. So, first of all, starting off with Juvenalian and Horatian satire, you had this slide that asked you what the difference is between them. Well, they are opposites. So Juvenalian satire is meant to be bitter, cruel, and angry, while Horatian satire is gentle and made to make people smile. So Horatian satire doesn't really attempt to poke fun or be angry or bitter towards people or towards situations, whereas Juvenalian satire is almost kind of more of dark humor, where it is meant to ridicule and be bitter and angry towards different groups of people or situations. So they are opposites. That's something important to keep in mind. So we have this comic here, and it says, identify whether the comic is Horatian or Juvenalian. It says, the only sure thing in life are death and taxes. Too bad they aren't in that order. So this is a little bit of dark humor. So this one is going to be Juvenalian satire. So again, this is meant to be more of a dark humor, trying to ridicule different situations or groups of people. We have another comic here. It says, I'm dying for COVID to end. Now this is a little bit more playful. It's made to make people smile. So this is going to be a Horatian style of satire. Then we have this one. We have two, I think that's a ham and a sausage maybe, and they're leaving a hospital, and it says, I feel so much better, and that's labeled as cured meats. Again, this is more playful, silly, so this is a Horatian style of satire. So anytime you're considering the difference between these two, just know that Juvenalian is supposed to be more of a dark humor, and Horatian is supposed to be more like puns and more playful. So then we're going to get into our specific satirical devices. So first one, everybody's very familiar with this, is sarcasm. So the definition of sarcasm is a tone of voice that implies the opposite of what is directly stated for the purpose of ridiculing, criticizing, or condemning the other person. So an example of this is, wow, you look so cool, when somebody has mustard all over his or her face. Now something important to remember though is sarcasm and verbal irony are not the same. They are very, very similar, but they are not exactly the same. So I'll explain that a little bit more when we get to verbal irony, but something important to note is that sarcasm and verbal irony are not the same thing. Very similar, but not the same. So then we have an anachronism, and this is an act of placing things in a time period in which they do not belong, either deliberately or accidentally. So now this example down at the bottom, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this before, so I also like to mention Night of the Museum. when they have all of these historical figures come to life in a modern day context, but they're meant to be living like hundreds of years ago. But the example that I have down here is the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, when they bring historical figures such as Abraham Lincoln to the present day. So again, like think of Night at the Museum, when you have like the dinosaur roaming around or the cavemen who go out into the street. That would be an example of this satirical device. And it is supposed to be funny. It is supposed to put them into funny situations. Then you have a parody. You guys have probably heard of parody before and are familiar with different TV shows that are parodies or movies. The definition is a parody is a work that imitates an original work in order to make fun of it or criticize it. Saturday Night Live is a big show that does a lot of different parodies. The example that I have is the movie Spaceballs is a parody of Star Wars. So again, the entertainment industry likes to use parodies in TV shows and movies to poke fun or criticize or make people laugh. Then we have a hyperbole. Hyperboles are one of my favorites. This says hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration meant to emphasize the extent of something. So the example that I have that most times is used as an example of a hyperbole is, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. That's obviously an exaggeration, so you couldn't actually eat a horse. Maybe you could, but you probably couldn't eat a horse, so this is an extreme exaggeration to emphasize how hungry you are. That would be a hyperbole. And then you have an understatement, which is actually the opposite of a hyperbole. So that note down there at the bottom says, note, an understatement is the opposite of a hyperbole. So that's something important to keep in mind. But the definition is an understatement means to say less than the reality of the situation in order to create emphasis. For example, when your printer breaks the night before a major essay is due and you say, we have a small problem here. That's an understatement. That would be a really big problem probably. So again, you're trying to emphasize the situation by kind of belittling whatever situation you're in. So, and again, something important to note is that an understatement is the opposite of a hyperbole. Then you have a juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a fun word to say, so I do like this one as well. The definition of it is to place items side by side for the sake of comparison. The example is the opening of A Tale of Two Cities contains a list of juxtapositions. The famous opening line of it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So comparison of two different things, and you put them side by side. That is a juxtaposition. A malapropism, they are the use of incorrect words in the place of correct words for comedic effect. These can sometimes be hard to distinguish or hard to pick out because you have to know the definition of the word and know that it's not placed in the correct context. So the example that I have is Mrs. Malaprop said, illiterate him quite from your memory. Illiterate, that is not the right use of that word. She means obliterate, which is similar in terms of spelling, but very different in terms of what they actually mean. So again, these can be kind of hard to distinguish because you have to know the definition of that word. But my suggestion for these is to read the sentence a few different times. And if you notice that something is off, especially one particular word, it's probably a malapropism. So something to consider as we go into our readings, and also when you take your quiz, read the sentence carefully and try to pick out any words that don't belong or that you think have a different meaning. Then we have bathos. The definition is to shift from something serious to something ridiculous, much like the punchline of a joke. Bathos, you can pronounce them both ways. So an example of this is the most important things in life are a good education, family, and fortnight. So again, the fortnight piece is supposed to be something that's a little bit more lighthearted and funny in comparison with the seriousness of education and family. So shifting from something that is serious or actually meaningful and then going on to something silly or funny to create like a punchline of a joke. Then we get into the ironies. So this is situational irony, when the opposite of what you expect to happen actually happens. So situational irony example would be a fire station burns down. Again, ironic because a fire station is supposed to put out fires and the fire station itself burns down. Then we have verbal irony. Verbal irony is usually the most commonly used. It's a type of irony in which a person says or writes one thing but means the opposite. So this is your explanation as to why verbal irony and sarcasm are different. Verbal irony can be confused with sarcasm because they are very similar, but sarcasm carries the purpose of ridiculing, while verbal irony doesn't always mean to ridicule. So when you're being sarcastic, you have the intention of ridiculing somebody or ridiculing a situation, whereas verbal irony, it just means the opposite of what the person is actually saying. So it doesn't necessarily carry the purpose of ridiculing a situation or somebody. So an example of verbal irony would be when a person steps out into a hurricane and says, "What nice weather we are having." It sounds sarcastic, but the purpose of that statement is not to wound, ridicule, or criticize somebody else. So they are kind of hard to distinguish, but what I want you to know for now is that they're not the same. Very, very similar, but they are not the same. Sarcasm is used to ridicule someone. Verbal irony is just meant to mean the opposite of what the person is actually saying. Then we have dramatic irony. Shakespeare was a big fan of dramatic irony. So it says dramatic irony occurs when an audience knows something that a character does not know. So again, Shakespeare, big fan of dramatic irony. And it says, in his play Macbeth, the audience knows that Macbeth is planning to murder Duncan while the king himself does not know. So again, this is something that Shakespeare really liked in a lot of his plays. When we read Shakespeare later on, this will be something to keep an eye on. And then a paradox. A paradox is a statement of opposites that actually reveals some type of truth. Paradox is a hard term to pick out and hard to distinguish in a text because paradox can most times be very confusing. So the example that I have here is water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So again, paradoxes are usually confusing in some type of element, but they are meant to reveal some type of truth by stating opposites, a set of opposites. And then an epigram. An epigram is a short but insightful statement, often in verse form, which communicates a thought in a witty, paradoxical, or funny way. So the example for here is, I can resist everything but temptation. So obviously that in itself is very paradoxical. But the reason it's an epigram is because it is a very short, insightful statement, whereas paradoxes are usually drawn out into multiple sentences or a paragraph even. And then we have a pun. This is the last one that I'll review. Puns are most often used by dads, and you have all of your dad jokes are usually puns. So a definition of a pun is a play on words that oftentimes uses the words that sound the same for humorous effect. So your example is, what kind of guitar does a fish play? And you have a bass guitar. I'm supposed to take the word for bass. So again, lots of dad jokes from these. That's all I have for you guys. Please make sure you watch this in order to prep for your quiz.